My name is Manina Jones, and I'm a professor in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the traditional territory on which Museum London is located, here at the forks of the Thames, the Escunasipi, La Tranche, and to respect the long-standing relationships of the three local First Nations groups of this land in southwestern Ontario. The Attawandaron peoples once settled this region alongside the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee peoples. The three long-standing indigenous groups of this geographic region are the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenni-Lenape peoples. It's a real honor to be here this morning at Words Fest with poets Madeline Bassnett and Penn Kemp. So here's the order of events that I thought we would do over the next hour or so. I will introduce our featured poets individually, and we'll get a chance to sample some of their work in the form of a reading. We will then settle into our comfy positions at the front and have a bit of a conversation, which we can open up to the audience as well. So I'll introduce Madeline first. We're going in alphabetical order. We can thank Western University's Department of English and Writing Studies, at least in part, for bringing my wonderful colleague, Madeline Bassnett, to the London, Ontario community from the Maritimes. Since in hiring her for a position in early modern writing, the department recognized the deeply enriching ways scholarly enterprise and poetic creativity can inform one another. I think we'll hear that in the poetry that we'll hear in a few minutes. Madeline teaches creative writing at Western and researches and teaches in the field of poetry and prose of the 16th and 17th century England, especially early modern women's writing, food studies, eco-criticism, and the early modern instructional manual, like recipe books, husbandry, and military manuals. She has an academic book forthcoming from Palgrave on women, food exchange, and governance in early modern England. Her deeply reflective, moving poetry has been published in journals such as Prairie Fire, Grain, Riddle Fence, The New Quarterly, The Fiddlehead, and the Malahat Review. She has published 2 chapbooks, Elegies from Frog Hollow in 2011, and most recently Pilgrimage from Baseline Press. Please welcome Madeline Bassnett.
Thanks, Manina, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank Josh Lambier for inviting me to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to be reading a few poems from my chapbook, Pilgrimage, which was put out by London's Baseline Press. Karen Schindler is in the second row. She did a lovely, beautiful job with this chapbook. I'm really honored to have such a wonderful looking work. I've been reading a fair bit of this from this around London recently, so I'm going to read 4 of these, and then I'm going to read 4 poems from the larger manuscript that this is part of. The manuscript is a breast cancer memoir, so that's part of what's going on in Pilgrimage. Pilgrimage kind of reflects 2 sort of modes of being. One is the kind of real world of going through chemotherapy treatments and walking myself through it. The other world is a kind of psychological landscape of pilgrimage, thinking about the idea of going through a kind of arduous physical journey that results in some sort of transformation, traditionally spiritual, but I think that idea of transformation can be anything in some ways. My model for this pilgrimage walk is the Santiago de Compostela route in northern Spain, which I have not actually walked. I confess that I have driven, which seems like a terrible confession, but I do promise to get back and actually walk one of the days. It's an amazing place. So obviously the pilgrimage has its place in many spiritual faiths. This Christian model, though, led me to the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, which form the kind of other organizing structure of the chapbook, which is organized by title into the 7 deadly sins and virtues. So I'm going to read a couple of sins and a couple of virtues. And I'll start off with envy. These are the crawling days, when the effort to stand sends me to my knees in supplication, prostrates me. Hot trodden dirt traces palm creases, folds of my shirt, balls itself between cracked lips, under my tongue. But the days move on, and so must I, attendance and lists, red pens checking off my arrival. I grip the ground, pull myself across pitted terrain, feet scrabbling to push like 2 burrowing voles. I am sick with the loamy stink of earth, the scuffed up grit, watching the solid boots of hikers miss me by inches, my feeble advances insignificant as a worm's. Their brisk strides mock me, thudding beside my head. How I yearn to rise, rejoin that happy onward rush, its thoughtless pumping, the foolish certainty of vigor. Avarice. The days I skim through. Heat-sparked meadows thronged with Queen Anne's lace and clover, the tempting gold of tansy. I look to be lost, left in this uncharted space, redolent of hay and heat, the motes of pollen. Finally, I burn with growth, waist bends like fireweed, thrusting past shade, streaked by light for the first time. Or so it seems, this pulsing moment slipping already from numbed fingertips. Orisons dwindle into breath, unschooled dance stutters back to a walk, white blood cells tighten themselves for the next assault. Can I not store this red gold day? A treasure to unwrap in secret, coins warming my palm with their promise, their beckoning glint, my greedy hands, hoarding them away. Okay, now I've got 2 virtues for you. The virtues were harder to write than the sins, which is maybe to be expected. Hope. The tight-lipped, nub-headed push of it, weed tendril piercing baked soil, stretching its leaves like a sturdy conqueror planning to people the earth, or a swaggering plowman flinging seeds into dirt as if the ground could unclench its knotted hands, tuck nuggets into soiled crevices, hoard the desire to multiply, make itself rich with growth. Would I were a weed, patient and stubborn, stalk unharmed by calloused souls, roots driving down, invisible resilience flaring through worm-tunneled muck of the earth. Charity. Step circle in endless return, hedged in by labyrinth, 3 turns to the left, 1 to the right, that cold room always waiting. I could run, could dive through the tight weave of branches knotting me in. What would it matter? My feet are tough, legs 2 stout pillars beneath me. Am I not well? You are not well, say the nurses, beckoning to a vinyl chair. Sun warms my back, the foot-ground path rises into my heels, its insistent presence leading always to this calm kindness, practiced hands that trust me in blankets, pat me down. So easy, obedience. Muscles slump into inertia, veins surface beneath hot wraps, body softens into the chair like wax, ready to receive. Okay, so the next few I want to read are from the larger manuscript. And I want to start off with The Secret Life of Crabs. And this is partly inspired by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei's installation, River Crabs, which you may have seen. It's kind of a huge pile of plastic crabs climbing on top of each other. The Secret Life of Crabs. I found them always slightly repellent, their ways of hiding, their sideways scuttle. Pincers opening and closing like grasping hands, the strange motions of their mouths, small tongues licking non-existent lips, like the mouths of villains anticipating someone's pain. Their communal ways, clambering over each other's brittle shells, the rise and fall of multitudes of legs clicking and scraping, each indistinguishable, as if replicated from one source, armored bodies stiff and mechanical. Their dim pools, their crannies and caves, the way they appear unnoticed, voraciously reproducing, sending their larvae out like scouts, looking for a ledge, a welcoming outpost, finding them now in my body. Even here, their oppressive presence, their disharmonious imposition of will. The next poem is part of a kind of another grouping in the manuscript, which kind of thinks about the diagnostic, sort of technological diagnostics that a cancer patient goes through. This one is about the gamma camera, which was maybe one of the more strange things I had to deal with. You kind of lie in a bed underneath this large black box that picks up gamma rays from radioactive dye that has been shot into you so that the surgeon can then find the bits that they need to take out. When I Googled what a gamma camera was, or a gamma ray was, I discovered that there were gamma ray telescopes that you can look through the galaxy at, and these pictures of the galaxy were really amazing. So that kind of enters into the poem. Made me feel better somehow, I don't know. Gamma camera. Look with a gamma ray telescope. You'll see the galaxy's glowing body, the orange femur, yellow stars spilling from the marrow like cells, tiny spaceships clustering in the fibrous blue beyond. The moon, a glowing nucleus. My gamma rays are black, dotted around my breast like outlying planets, a revolving path of departure imprinted on paper. Here is the voyage of technetium-99. There are the lymph nodes, oval as beans. Look at me through your telescope. Does the air around me crackle with stars? Do golden tracers arc across the sky of my breast, its fibrous avenues gleaming through darkness? The next poem, Indifference, kind of uses the Sendai tsunami to think about the question, why me? And the sort of obvious answer, why not me? Begins with an epigraph from Julian Barnes's Levels of Life. It is all just the universe doing its stuff, and we are the stuff it is being done to. It's a wave I've never seen before, unleashed from a spring, mindless, faceless, racing over the land as if it were nothing. As if we were nothing, all our careful rituals shrugged aside, flat, indifferent, vast as a plane, knocking us over like toys. So lonely, knowing that nothing cares, as if we were insects scuttling beneath a looming shadow. Just a cellular mistake, as blameless and unlucky as that yellow car, puny at the edge of the wave's unyielding approach. Its mechanical jerks, its stop and go, its desperate turn onto fields, trying to outrun the oncoming sweep, the finale inevitable as the flies, legs vibrating against the cords that wrap lovingly around it. But it's not about love or hate. The tsunami will crush the tinny roof, toss away the car like trash, and the cell will replicate endlessly, pushing through my body in its own mindless rush. It feels nothing for me, doesn't know I call this body mine, as if I could govern its ebb and flow. But I know precisely nothing, a slight object aching for attention, a universal nod towards goodness, obedience, my right to exist. And I'm going to finish off with a poem called Colony Collapse, which is thinking about the death of bees by neonicotinoids, but that also, within that, I'm trying to think about our kind of interdependence, not only on our own cells, but on the larger natural world as well. Colony Collapse. Survivors crawl across withered black comb, invisible apocalypse, sisters wandering lost in the cornfields, seduced by filaments of silk, the toxic pollen. Scooping up death, no distinction between friend and foe, all obliterated in service of unblemished fields, poisoned bees littering the ground. Always one wing beat away, the hive's low hum of welcome washed into air, torn apart by a breeze. Sent down streams like the limbs of Orpheus, the queen perched on her throne, wondering who will come to feed her. Regal head tilting patiently, big eyes surveying the decay. Where is her long train, her cloak of swarming bodies, tight as tapestry? Gone, all gone, her own body meaningless without them. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. I should warn you that the last time I introduced Penn Kemp, it was when she was serving as Western's writer-in-residence, and a colleague asked me on the spur of the moment, and this is never a good idea with me, I do not speak extemporaneously, and I don't know what happened, but when I stood up to introduce Penn, I tripped over my tongue and ended up giving what amounted to a kind of incomprehensible sound poetry performance that culminated in the unintentional and explosive use of a four-letter word. Penn has that effect on people. So I hope I will be more coherent today. Penn, who is a performance poet, an activist, and a playwright, has been a force of nature across the variegated landscapes of London's creative community for decades. The Writers' Union of Canada calls her a one-woman literary industry. In 2015, she was the League of Canadian Poets Spoken Word Artist of the Year, and she has been Creative Age London's Writer-in-Residence, as well as being the inaugural Poet Laureate of London, Ontario. She has published 25 books of poetry and drama, plays, CDs, sound operas, and has recently edited 2 volumes called Women in Multimedia and Women in Performance for the League of Canadian Poets, as well as the collection Barbaric Cultural Practice. And she's also working on revising a play for production in the spring called The Triumph of Teresa Harris. So please join me in welcoming Penn Kemp.
Manina, that has remained private with me and the 200 other people who heard it on that day. But I was introduced as Penn. I have never stopped laughing about it, but I honestly have been private about it, Manina, honestly. But now, since you have made it public, want me to stay private? Just you and me, folks. Yeah, just between a few friends. I wrote a poem for, I thought Josh had been doing such an amazing work for this festival, and I know everybody else that has been working with him, but for us, for the people, I think it's our connection is through Josh. And I wrote a poem for the piece of words, for the feast of words, for the festival. You can see how I become a sound poet. I can't even speak extra. Ode for the feast of words. Our London muses amused proclaim, come join our museum feast in joy of joining, reading, weaving away, riding a wave. Waving, welcome, well, come in then, here. Attendance is high, attention is close. Words are vocation, invoking the vocative pro. Vocative calling is calling on us, call. Sure, culture, meeting our many cultures collected. Call, elect, Whatever the weather, we conjure, compose words worth revisioned, envisioned, inclusive in terms of the other for all our sakes. Describing the arc's friends collect and meet new, gathering poets in harmony with authors. Rhythm rhymes as creating community, fusion delights a spacious collective. Call elective held in the London Community Bowl. The graces are present, spirits are high. Lift the cup and dance, sing, speak, tell the toll. Tell the tale told, win, right, welcome, may the best manifest, festive, all festivity. Cheer and exult, hail and salute, hear, hear. You may, some of us in the audience, as in the London Arts Council, may recognize some of those phrases which were first, like all the grace part, that came from a poem that I scavenged, that I first wrote for becoming the inaugural London Arts Council Poet Laureate, which I adored being, and I'm equally happy to be ex. The next piece I'm going to read is from an anthology called Women in Media, which I launched with another one, Women in Performance, at the Writers' Summit in Harbourfront in June. But this one deals with a project really dear to my heart, which is about Teresa Harris, London Eldon House's first lady. Well, she is actually the youngest of 12, and she doesn't live that down. She's really lives that through her life. And I first, thanks to Eldon House, we put it on as a processional play throughout Eldon House. Christine lent me the book. Oh, there's so many connections, but it was amazing to see her come alive in situ in the house. And the poem began in Poetry London's anthology Possession, and I'm going to read from it today, because the play, what the essay in this book talks about is the transformation. I always start with sound, with poetry, then it becomes narrative, and then it becomes a play or something, whatever. So this is the dream life of Teresa Harris. And again, thanks to the Arts Council, I am extending that one-act play to a 2-hour play, which will be put on by with the Eldon House and at the Palace Theatre in March. And that is that Triumph of Teresa Harris. It will be dealing in different ways with post-colonialism as well. So I have a lot more room to expand. The dream life of Teresa Harris. Born 1839, Eldon House. Died 1928. So she had an incredible span across Victorian mores. And I really was interested to see how she adapted to foreign cultures and how foreign cultures adapted to her. She retained some of her class and race stereotypical notions, that were common to the time, but she also was amazing, really resilient, and much loved by both her husbands. You wonder what prepared me. You know I am a gatherer, and gatherers often wander far from home, especially if they are last, the youngest of 12. All those brothers and sisters doubled up behind me, always older. No wonder I had to run all the way around the world to escape their constraint. They were forever first up the hill and fastest to hide away. They made the rules. I was eternally seeking them out across creaking floorboards, sure giveaways. Those secret places were mine, our ones they'd never fit. I could squirm under oak bureaus, sneak behind wardrobes, tucked between draped bronze lion claws. Growing up in such an upright house, I could never catch on to proper routine instilled by successions of nannies. I dreamed of escaping provincial mores, out from under my mother's petticoats, away from my brother's taunts, my sister's impossible glamour, the corsets apparel I'd never grow into, whatever my age. I, too, would be married into the ritual of household man-age meant, the daily round of what to wear, what to eat, and who is up to snuff. For this life, I am groomed. My sisters dream of gentlemen callers to whisk them into a comfortable future. I dread such confinement of finery hindered by lace nicety boxed in by picnic hamper. We are as high as we can be in this London. We have burned stumps to create a wooden town. We live at the forks of Antler River, nowhere to turn but out and away, escape into the wonderful wild. Somehow, I read Dreaming Mountain. I wander into the wood, already exploring, discovering land new to me, in clearings, in shifting currents of the Thames. Part 2. When Scott comes calling, asking for my hand, he promises Ladakh, Kashmir, India, lands where women like me do not go. Gladly accepting, I head off to honeymoon in immeasurable adventure. When Scott later dies, of course I marry St. George Littledale, our traveling companion. He is 15 years my junior. Now I am no longer the youngest. I gather men, my mother snipes, resenting our age difference. But I am his match. He offers me solace a long way from home. I gather information for the great game, the way he collects big game. We exchange formal family high tea for rancid yak butter laced with salt tea. My mother would bitterly complain if she knew how far I'd left her white linen, white skirts, white house for the peaks. And then this is a quote. On August the 4th, 1895, at a 19,000-foot pass on the north side of Goring La in Tibet, 48 miles from Lhasa, a 43-year-old Englishman, his 55-year-old wife, and a fox terrier, confronted over 150 Tibetans armed with primitive matchlocks. Teresa and George Littledale were known, St. George Littledale, as the greatest English explorers of their day, journeying further into the hidden lands of Asia than any Western explorer had previously achieved. We come so close to impenetrable Lhasa, I can almost breathe the air a pass away. We utterly refuse to go back an inch. They said their heads would be cut off if they did not send us back. I at once told St. George to say that if it were a question of my dying going over the pass or their heads being cut off, I preferred the latter. And she did. The last piece I'm going to read, I want to introduce my brand new book, Barbaric Cultural Practice. You can guess where I got the title from. but I picked the wrong one without the bookmark. So, Tulips. Yellow pollen from her poem collects on these elegant tulips. Real as our elbows at the table, where poets and students, so very few, gather to hear new poems courtesy the Canada Council, it must be acknowledged. Mary reads to the collected in the University lounge. I hear voices, she says, and the old room quivers. I hear voices. The ceiling falls into its walls. Some words are no longer allowed. Some phrases have been relegated to the therapist's cloakroom. If I hear voices, the room repeats to itself, then ipso facto, I am psychotic. Therefore, I will not hear voices. Mary hears herself in the silence. What have I said, she cries. The poets in her audience are responding. Let the voices multiply, let them converse, but do not tell your psychiatrist. Let him or her handle only ordinary neurosis. Leave the comfortable lounge to the adamantine marble academy, and what is important, to art. Mary retorts, we can only teach technique, not duende. What? Sans our usual subsistence subsidy, won't we poets disappear into teaching trades? Or simply disappear? Thank you.
So thus begins our conversation. And this is a portion of the hour where I get you to myself for a minute or two, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
What next?
And my first question is a little bit of a self-serving question. I'm teaching a course on Canadian literature, creativity, and the local. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be local. George Eliot Clark broached this yesterday in his talk, partly in talking about writing about the places we come from and the places we are, rather than trying to create some kind of universe. And actually Paul Chafe did as well, rather than trying to create a kind of a universal writing, and how much more successful writers feel when they dig in to where they come from or where they are. But I was thinking about a really wonderful TED Talks by the novelist Ty Selassie. And she says, don't ask me where I come from, ask me what is my local. And she talks about defining the local in terms of ritual, restrictions, and reflexivity. And I just wondered, what's your local? And how does that relate to your creative practice?
Not local public.
Yeah, well, that could be too.
That's a great way to start. Okay, so I really liked what you just said about the reflexivity and what was the other things that Ty Selassie and the reflection, reflexivity, and Anyway.
And restrictions.
And restrictions.
Relationships.
Okay, so lots of good R words. I think it's a really interesting question because I've moved around a lot in my life, and I think I've moved around enough to have decided that home is where you make it. So the local is kind of where you are now. I think especially in the poems that some of them that I've read today, for me the local is the immediate environment and the environment that I moved through repeatedly, and that kind of in some ways weird opportunity to just get to spend some time watching the natural world around me and engaging with it in some way as I walked the same paths over and over again.
Yeah, I was going to say that I could, as you were reading, I was thinking about the ways in which you describe the rituals of treatment and the process of treatment as one way of sort of embedding yourself in place, and the relationships between people that you find along the way. And the R that I would add, given the reading that you just gave, is reflection. You know, it's the kind of space of reflection of your writing.
And I think ritual was the word I was trying to remember, because I think that the walking and the reflection and the writing, which sounds like R but isn't, all kind of came together as a sort of a way of making everything kind of local in a sort of metaphorical way.
I was born in Strathroy and raised in London, graduated from Medway and Central and Western, and fled, graduated, married within 2 days, 1966, fled around the world, came back to the house that I was raised in, where I now live on Canterbury, and am perfectly happy after being a gypsy for 50 years. Perhaps I grew into London, but like Madeline, no one believes me. No one believes me when I say I'm an introvert, but truly I am, and my local is my house and yard in the Elsie Perrin Williams. And I really believe in activism and the local landscape, and I love the introduction of embracing the indigenous tribes that have inhabited this land for so many more decades and centuries than we have been here. And the Teresa play is, I'm working out how to be Teresa with her mindset, and yet how to absorb, how to have her reflect in a way that is, I'm having to create a modern character, an archaeologist or something that has the sense, she's not indigenous, but she has a sense of that, which Teresa does not have, except in relationship with a native cook that I made up, that no colonial house would have had. And yet it fascinates me, that dialectic of how open she is to the local, and how much for her as a colonial, complete colonial, she is so aware of the palimpsest of the other London, which is reality. And in truth, that pink map of the globe, where everything was the British Empire, was, I was proud of that. I was so proud that we were pink. And I want to write that into the play, that kind of how we have to unlearn so much of that palimpsest from the global to the local.
There's a wonderful poem by James Rainey where he talks about sitting in a schoolhouse near Stratford as a small child and looking at the walls and seeing those maps with the big patches of pink on them, and thinking about the ways in which he's sort of surrounded by the imperial world. And then he turns and looks out the window and he says, this is my map. This is a map where the scale is 1 to 1. And he sort of mentally goes out into the landscape.
It took going to England to realize I was not British at all.
So was Teresa Harris born in London?
Yes, Eldon House.
In Eldon House.
Eldon House.
So there are parallels between your lives. The gypsy.
How could you ever think that? Now you revealed my secret. It's so much is a revisioning of history. That's what I'm trying to contemplate. And that really, growing up in London, I looked to the other London as a reality, like Teresa. And I think that's completely changed here. And festivals like Words Fest make that happen, make us really value the local and what we're doing here. I just finished in time for the conference Andre Alexis's The Hidden Keys, and it ends with an absolute paean of praise to his adopted home, which is Toronto. But that book becomes, it's called The Hidden Keys, but the hidden key really is the discovery of home. Home is where the art is.
I wanted to ask you a question about the production of your works. Both of you published with small presses. And I wanted to, and actually I was really interested in Barbaric Cultural Practice, the ways in which a lot of it talks about the process of struggling with the computer. In reading Pilgrimage, there is a really strong sense of the beauty of the object of the book. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which the physical properties of your writing are represented by working with small presses. Or the process of actually getting it to that publishable state.
Coach House published my first book in '72. It was called Bearing Down and written on the birth of my daughter. And they allowed me at Rochdale, am I dating myself, to typeset the banners that went underneath. And they allowed me to oversee and learn the craft of actually making the book. So I've, with love, stayed with small presses my entire life just because of that hands-on. Unfortunately, with the high-tech stuff, it's become too hands-on or too... I'd like to withdraw from the necessity for marketing and so on. But yeah, the book, the idea of a beautiful book is my father was a painter and criticized my work at drawing, so I changed from painting to writing, but I still have a great love of the object and have chosen all the, this is a painting of a dream I had, not by me. I mean, I had the dream, but a friend did the thing. So that whole combination of the visual and the reality of the finished product and love.
I think the really wonderful thing about chapbooks is that becoming a beautiful object is part of the point. And both my chapbooks have been really lovely, and I felt like they've, like the care in which they're produced, they're produced in a very limited run. They're not mass market. They're published by one person in their room, sort of thing. Karen Schindler hand sews the bindings of her chapbooks, so they're very special. And I think, my father was a librarian, and I grew up, surrounded by books, but also I think with a kind of understanding of the book being a valuable and valued object and something to sort of hang on to and honor. And I feel really lucky that my first two books have kind of come out in that mode.
I love in that book the little bookmark that's built into the book. The bookmark that's built in. It makes it feel like a treasure. really, and the quality of the paper and the hand sewing and so on. It gives it, and actually, maybe I'll use this to lead to another question. It actually gives it the feel of being an artifact, being a kind of a historical, like a trace of historical practice. Like it sort of feels like it draws on a tradition of bookmaking. And I wanted to ask both of you about the role of history in your work, because Penn's been reading from a text that retells the story of the life of Teresa Harris, and presumably required a great deal of research, and a sense of the kind of historical depth of the place that we live in. And your work has a sense of occurring both really immediately and viscerally in the moment, in the current moment, and yet it has all these layers of religious discourse and historical practice and ritual that goes into the past. And I just wondered about that relationship between writing in the present but taking those kind of past layers into account.
I think in my case it probably has something to do with the fact that I teach and research in the Renaissance. That's not disconnected. And I think also, pilgrimage is a historical practice, so that in itself kind of informs the history. But I like to tell my class that everything I know about Christianity is from the Renaissance period, from working in the Renaissance. And I will confess that my thinking about the sins and virtues really comes from Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, which is a text I feel very ambivalent about in many ways, but it uses those sins and virtues in very visceral ways. And so the sins and virtues are from Spenser. I reread John Milton's Paradise Regained when I was writing this, and because that's about another type of pilgrimage of Christ going out into the desert and meeting his tempter and all that sort of thing, and kind of coming through the end. I read a lot about walking and the history of walking and the history of pilgrimage practices. So I guess all those things kind of came together, I suppose successfully, if you're feeling like they're in there within the book, to perhaps give it a sense of historical depth.
I think of London as a palimpsest, with all these English overlays, the Thames upon the Escalicity, and what I'd like to retrieve is the real vocal coming up from roots and speaking to us, so that we have both, so we're seeing with double vision.
Okay. I have many other questions I really want to ask, but I think I'm being selfish. So I'll open up the opportunity for questions from the audience. Or I could ask for questions. Yes, Kim? Do we need to pass the microphone back?
I'll try and shout it out. Thank you both for these really, really rich readings. Madeline, when I was listening to you read, I felt like I was being squeezed. It was incredibly moving. And I think about that last poem and the devastation of our shared precarity, the poisoned bees and our poisoned bodies. And I wanted to ask you about that shared precarity, but instead, I'm going to ask you a question that you actually just touched upon, I think, but I'm really interested in, and hopefully other people are too. You are in this unique position of being a scholar and a poet, a scholar who teaches poetry as well as writing it. And I remember when I was in graduate school feeling like, the work that I was doing was killing my creative spirit. And I wonder how you negotiate that relationship between the scholarly work that you do and the artistic work you do.
That's a good question. It's not always smooth. I feel like I'm lucky enough to be in a position where both sides of what I do is valued by my institution. So I don't have to choose. And in fact, moving into teaching creative writing at Western has given me a kind of, I don't know, permission to say, no, I'm going to focus on my creative work now, because actually that's important too, because otherwise the academic takes over. It's just all consuming, and it's very hard to like push it aside. I mean, that said, I find it hard to write two things at the same time. If I'm working very intensely on some academic writing, often the poetry has to go to the side, and vice versa. I think I'm interested in making that space more, more for saying, this is poetry space, and I'm going to spend 2 or 3 months working on that. And that's okay. So, but it's a struggle, because I think one is always kind of struggling with the parameters of institutional expectation to some extent.
I think that's wonderful, though, because in 1966, when I graduated from honors English, I felt I had to absolutely choose between academe and being the gypsy poet that had to experience life. And guess which I chose?
I was wondering, and thank you both very much. I really have enjoyed both of the readings. In London, is it hard to look at London now? Because I kind of perceive that it's going through lots of shifts and changes away from the Eldon House era, certainly, and into an era that really hasn't been defined yet. Especially if you think about our downtown, just looking at our downtown. Is it difficult as a poet to look at contemporary society and sort of mine it for these kind of themes, or are these kinds of ideas something that you find rich, rewarding, and that you want to explore?
I'll respond to that. I think it's imperative as a poet to respond viscerally and immediately to concerns, occasional poetry, but as an activist, I find the split is not between me and academe, but between me and activism, because if I'm out there in the world, I can't be writing. So what I've chosen to do is focus on the writing as a way of being an activist, just because of the lack of energy and age.
I would more or less echo Penn in a lot of ways. I think that, although I think a lot of my work is personal, especially what I've just read, I think that it is important to think beyond the self, and whether or not that's kind of in a more sort of global sense in terms of thinking about, the body and the earth and the way these two things relate to each other, or thinking about more generally the way in which illness and health relate to each other, and what happens when we suddenly step into the other world of illness when we've been healthy for all of our lives. I think all of these things are kind of larger concerns that make writing poetry, and I think reading poetry, more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You actually, all the amazing poetry you read about, like, while you were dealing with your illness and stuff, did you find it took more strength to find the creativity while you were sick, or did that creativity actually give you strength while you were ill?
I would say it gave me strength. It gave me something to focus on. I read a couple of years ago, her name is Jenny Diskey, who died recently. She used to write for the London Review of Books, and she wrote other things as well. And she was diagnosed with lung cancer sort of around the same time I was. And in one of her essays, she said, I don't really have anything new to say. I'm another cancer patient going through cancer things. But, this is how I deal with things, and this is what I know. And so writing gives me the strength to just deal with it and to sort of say what I know and to understand my experience. And for me, I would say absolutely. It was a way for me to focus on something else other than sort of feeling sorry for myself and feeling as though something else would come out of this. Looking forward to, I guess, change or renewal or, yeah, something good coming out of that. Yeah.
I'll respond to that too, because I think that for me, writing, the gut writing can come out of severe illness or long bouts of illness. But the editing, I don't have a brain when I'm really ill, so the gut writing comes out, but the editing comes when I'm well.
I had thought that too in thinking about your work, Madeline, because of the ways in which the conventions and structures of pilgrimage and this sins and virtues sort of discipline the suffering that you describe, and they give it a shape and a pattern. Sort of it's another of the things that I wanted to ask about, and that's sort of the idea of being in space. And you before you did your reading, you said, "I'll walk you through this," and I thought that how important walking is, but walking is a metaphor for being connected to the place you are, and for being in process with it too.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think part of it is about just making shapes. I'm not writing in traditional form in any of these poems, but I like working with shape and restriction and the ways in which working with those restrictions and shapes around me make me use words differently and make me think differently and make me see differently in ways that I hope I can somehow communicate in the poems themselves.
Actually, sorry, just to interrupt. I thought, oh, there are poetic feet here. And I started to try and scan the poems because I thought there must be feet.
2 feet.
There are 2 feet.
There are 2 feet, yeah.
8 feet. Walking for me is essential, and in London we are in a bowl, and we have such astonishing trails just around, and the whole beauty of just today. The walking itself gives me a rhythm for writing.
I think we're at time. Thank you all very much for coming, and join me please in thanking Madeline and Penn for a terrific